Welcome back to the history of the United States up to 1877. We're going to continue our conversation of the colonial period by discussing the Massachusetts Bay and New England colonies between 1607 and around 1700. Now, last time we were here, we did the same time period, except in Virginia colony around Jamestown. So this time we're going to take a look at the other major colony. Now, I'm not going into a bunch of detail on these various colonies. Obviously, you know there are 13. I'm just going to hit the two biggest ones and contrast them and kind of move from there. So in order to address these New England colonies, we're going to take a look at Plymouth Colony, obviously, in 1620, and then we'll move on to the Great Puritan Migration, the creation of Boston and Massachusetts Colony and all of that, and eventually we'll work our way to the religious conflict that will lead to the creation of other colonies in New England. All right. Now, of course, most people don't know about Popham Colony. This was the first colony established in New England. So we're going to start talking about that briefly, just so you know it existed, and then we'll talk about the circumstances that led to the foundation of Plymouth in 1620. So here is a map of Popham Colony. It was established by the Plymouth Company in 1606. This particular map comes from the journal of a man named John Hunt, one of the colonists there. Let me get out of the way so you can see it. There we go. So this is a map of Fort St. George in 1607. You can see that there's a church and storehouses. There are walls around it and cannons stationed in certain locations. So obviously this was needed for protection. Now, Popham Colony was established by the Plymouth Company. The Plymouth Company, like the Virginia Company, came to being in 1606 and began to recruit adventurers who wanted to go and try to, make some money. Popham Colony came about in August of 1607, just a few months after Jamestown. However, it didn't last as long. There were some internal conflicts that led to the site being abandoned. Now, the most famous of the New England colonies is, of course, Plymouth Colony. And for us to understand Plymouth Colony, we're going to have to look at the people that created the colony and what they are. Now, a lot of people, they think of these pilgrims as Puritans. That is not true. That is not true at all. They're more extreme than Puritans, and Puritans are pretty extreme if you know anything about history of the English Civil War. So we're going to talk briefly about the history of the Reformation, where these separatists come from, how are they different than your typical pilgrim or your Anglican, and what led them to the New World. Okay, so we got to start with John Calvin. John Calvin was a Puritan minister in the same vein as Martin Luther. He fled France in 1534, and his big contribution to the Reformation included several concepts, including one known as predestination. And this is the idea that before you're born, God has selected a set number of people to go to heaven, right? There's nothing that you can do. There's no action, there's no good deed that can actually get you to heaven. It's only faith in God. Now, of course, that's something that Luther also believed, but Calvin took it one step further, saying that, even good behavior and being a good person made no difference. So this is a little bit of an extreme view, at least at the time it was considered extreme. In England, there are quite a few proponents of Calvinism and this call to reform the church, the Catholic Church at the time. And of course, the English Reformation, which occurred under the auspices of Henry VIII, had very little to do with religion. Had very little to do with religious dogma and argument, and everything to do with Henry wanting a divorce from his wife so that he could marry his mistress and create a legitimate heir to the throne. So many of these Calvinists were unsatisfied with the English Reformation because they felt that the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was basically Catholic light. It's the same church, had the same flowery words and practices. It just had a different pope. The pope is the king instead of an Italian hanging out in Rome. So there's a group of people inside the Anglican Church called Puritans. Their intention was to purify the church from the inside, to purify it of Catholic influence, to do away with the liturgy, right? They didn't like the fancy prayers and the golden candlesticks and all of the trappings of the Catholic Church. They wanted to purify it, right? Now there would be some Protestant issues, obviously, with Queen Mary Tudor and Protestants being murdered, and Elizabeth coming in and reversing that on Catholics. So we know there's some conflict going on in the 1500s. Now, flash forward to King James. King James is from Scotland. He is the King of England. He's the head of the Church of England, and he sees religious dissidents as an affront to his authority. Okay, so there is a direct link between church and state here, and James doesn't want this internal conflict, and so he decides in January of 1604 to have a meeting, a religious debate, if you will, that he hopes to resolve some of these issues. Now, some of the things that the Puritans want, for example, are they want to outlaw lay baptism, right? They don't want non-ministers or non-religious people baptizing parishioners. They want that to be done by ministers. They also don't like words and phrases like confirmation and absolution, right? They don't like these Catholic concepts that are sort of hanging around inside the Anglican Church. So at Hampton Court, they have a conference. They decide on a lot of things. For example, they encourage the king to commission a new translation of the Bible, which of course we know is the King James version of the Bible, sometimes referred to as one of the most beautiful translations of the Bible. Now, despite this, anti-Puritan clerics ascended to the Archbishopric of Canterbury. Right, so people who were against these Puritan ideas are going to gain control of the church, and they are going to start really cracking down on these Puritans. Right, you need to follow Anglican rules, you need to follow Anglican liturgy, and they start removing Puritan ministers from their churches. They start fining groups of Puritans for not following the precepts of the Anglican Church. And so there branches out another group from the Puritans, right? So you got two groups, Anglicans, who are kind of Catholic light, and then you've got Puritans who want to purify the church from within. Well, because of this treatment, another group sprang out of the Puritans, and they're called Separatists. These people do not believe that you can purify the church from within. They think it's too lost, it's too gone, it's too corrupt. And so they want to challenge the Anglican Church and branch off and create their own denomination. This is seen as a direct threat to James as the head of the church. And I need to remind you probably that King James is a little bit tender about the subject of separatists and people challenging the church's authority. It was only in 1605 that there was a terrorist plot to murder all the members of Parliament and the king by some Catholics. And it's called the Gunpowder Plot. And so you've probably heard of that before. Anyway, so there was some threat of religious separatists and people challenging the king's authority that was taken seriously. As a result of the hostile environment in England, Puritans, these separatists really, they're not Puritans, they're separatists, are going to leave. They're going to abandon England for Leiden, Holland. As you can see on this map here, they're going to leave England and go into Holland. Leiden is very tolerant and welcoming to the Puritans. They really don't have a problem with the Puritans worshiping the way they want to. However, the culture in Leiden is too secular. It's too worldly. And these separatists are afraid that their children are going to gravitate toward Dutch culture, Dutch language, Dutch attitudes and behaviors, and they're losing their Englishness. They're losing their heritage. So after a couple of years living here, these separatists are like, okay, you know what? We need to leave here because our children are going to be Dutch and not English. So let's relocate to the New World, right? So let's sign up with this land grant with the Virginia Company, and let's sail for this New England. So they would do so in July of 1620. Got on board a ship called the Speedwell. However, on their way back to England, the Speedwell suffered a hull leak, and the group was forced to sell the ship in Plymouth. It is here that the colonists decided to join up with an existing ship that already had some colonists on it, and this ship was called the Mayflower. And they finally set sail for America in September of 1620. All right, so that's kind of getting you into the position where, where are these separatists coming from? How they're different from Puritans. They're quite different. They're far more extreme than Puritans, and Puritans are pretty extreme. So they abandon their ship, the Speedwell. They join up with some other colonists already on their way to what they call Northern Virginia on board a ship called the Mayflower. Now the Mayflower would have looked similar to this. Let me get out of the way. This is a cross-section of a typical merchant vessel in the 1600s. They're quite small and cramped. And Puritans, there are about 102 of these separatists, and they are going to join another group of travelers, and in total there's going to be about 120 cramped on board this little merchant vessel. Storms are going to damage the main mast, and they'll have to kind of shore it up as best they can with the materials that they have. And because of the damage to the ship, they would get a little bit off course, and they would land near Cape Cod in early November of 1620. And this, of course, would be modern-day Massachusetts. Now, interestingly enough, one of the first things that these English colonists did before they got off their boat is they signed what's called the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact is really interesting, particularly for those who are interested in political theory. You'll know that Thomas Hobbes will come out in 1650 with his famous political treatise known as Leviathan, where he postulates that the first governments were created through what's called a social contract. People get together, they create a government so that they can be secure in their property and their papers and whatnot. And you think, well, where did he get that idea? That's such a brilliant idea. Well, he got it from history, right? I mean, that's what these people did when they came over from the Mayflower. So I'll read to you a little bit of the Mayflower Compact. You can follow along in the notes, the speaker's notes that are provided. I've got the entire text of it in there, but I'll just kind of give you a little bit of it here. Quote, have an undertaking for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant ye first colony in northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in ye presence of God and one another, combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and prosecution and furtherance of ye ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So this essentially is a social contract. We agree to work together in concert. We also agree to submit to the will of the group. We're going to vow submission and obedience to these councils that we create. This is self-government. So the roots of self-government in American history and the history of the United States go way back to a time before the United States was even around, because you have to create a culture of self-government before you can even pretend to have self-government. And this is true if you look at other countries that the United States is trying to encourage self-government in. One of the great examples in the news right now is Afghanistan. Afghanistan doesn't have that tradition of self-government, and so it was very difficult for that culture to appreciate it. Same thing could be said for the history of Mexico. So regardless, we have this Mayflower Compact. These 120 settlers are agreeing to link themselves together in sort of a body politic. Now, how does the actual colony operate? There are a couple of standouts, people that are important. Myles Standish, he's not a separatist, he's not a religious zealot, but he does befriend the Pilgrims when they were in Holland, and he decided to join their group as sort of a security guard, right? Because these separatists, these religious separatists, they're nonviolent. They're very naive about the world. Here comes Myles Standish, who is he's a former military man. He's going to be able to provide them a little bit of protection. Now, the most famous Pilgrim leader is William Bradford. William Bradford was born sometime around 1590. He lived to the 1650s, and he was elected governor of Plymouth Colony 30 times. Right, so this guy is definitely a leader of Plymouth Colony, and it's really from his diary, his account, that we know about early Plymouth Colony and life in early Massachusetts. So what was life like? Well, from Plymouth Colony, we know that when the Pilgrims got off the boat, they started to look around, look for a place to settle. They were really shocked to find fields already plowed and prepared. They found stores of corn and grain. It would have seemed to these people as if God had prepared this place for them. The actual sort of dark truth to this is that smallpox and European diseases had wiped out entire villages, and this village was abandoned because of disease. And so the natives had prepared the ground and had stored their feed, but then had to abandon the site because of disease. But regardless, the Pilgrims didn't know this. They gathered some corn. They began to prepare for winter. I mean, we're getting in November here. There's no time to plant food. There's no time to prepare for winter. You have to be prepared for it. And so these men and women are going to have a hard winter. And then they get some help, right? So famously, some natives just show up, right? So Samoset was the first one. He first made contact with the Pilgrims in March of 1621. He just walked up to them out of the blue, just walked out of the woods. And you think about, the situation that these Pilgrims are in. Here you are, trying to carve out a life in a wilderness. And then this native just walks right out of the woods, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, are we going to have a fight? Is this guy going to kill us? Are we going to be, burned? What are they going to do? And he just walks right up to these Pilgrims and just says, hi. He starts talking in English, and it completely blew these people away. You think about the probability. What's the probability that you would find like the one or two natives in New England that actually speak English, and the Pilgrims found that guy? The first thing he did is he asked for beer. He's like, hey, you have a beer? I'd love a beer. So he comes in, says hi, asks for a beer, and promises to bring someone who's better at English, right? Someone who speaks English better than he does. And so a little bit later, another native named Squanto arrives at the colony, where he acts as a translator and an envoy and a representative between these Pilgrims and the surrounding natives. Squanto's history is sort of interesting. He was captured by an English explorer and sold as a slave in Spain. It is here that some Christian monks, some Catholic monks, bought him and educated him. Eventually, he was awarded his freedom and traveled back to his home, only to sadly discover everyone in his village had died from illness, from smallpox or some type of illness. He eventually came, as I just said, he came into the home of these Pilgrims, where he continued to live as a translator and an ambassador with neighboring tribes. He also taught the Pilgrims local methods of agriculture. You wrap a fish up in a leaf or something and you plant it, with the corn, and it helps to fertilize. The little tricks like that they would learn. Of course, these Pilgrims, they know how to farm. Okay, I mean, they're not. If you lived in the ancient world, you knew how to farm. I mean, that's all there is to it. If you lived in this time, everyone could farm. It's kind of like if you owned a car. In the 1960s, you knew how to work on a car. Everybody did, right? I mean, it's just because that was sort of a normal thing that everyone had to know. In 1600, you knew how to farm. It was just something they knew. But there were certain, differences in the soil and the temperatures and the way of life that the natives were able to teach these pilgrims some different methods. Eventually, the pilgrims would sign an alliance with a local native chieftain called Massasoit. Massasoit, he looked at the pilgrims as a great way to shore up the security of his own tribe. His tribe had been depopulated by smallpox and different diseases, and this made it ripe for attack, right? To be attacked by traditional enemies, historic enemies. I know we like to look at the natives as if they're all peaceful and they love the environment and they're wonderful angelic type creatures, and that's not true. I mean, natives were people, right? I mean, these were people. They were good, they were bad, they were nice, they were benevolent, they were mean and vicious. I mean, they were just like people. So Massasoit had his own enemies, had his own wars that he would fight, particularly against the Narragansett, who were located kind of south into the west, kind of near Rhode Island. And so, Massasoit saw these Europeans and decided, I'm going to make an alliance with these people in order to protect myself from my own enemies. And so that would be a close friendship with the colonists. And so the colonists in New England had a very different relationship with the natives than what you saw in Virginia Company. They're going to be a lot more cooperative, have a lot more stable treaties. The people of Plymouth will not break any of the treaties that are established with their native friends, right? I mean, others might, but the pilgrims won't. So what was life like? How did this colony hope to make money? What was their expectation? So once they're established, what are they trying to do here? Their little colony would have been, look kind of like this reproduction, this little village that you can go and visit in New England, where they try to preserve what these colonies might have looked like. Very quaint, very small shacks that with thatch roofs and things like this. But the economics of Plymouth were actually pretty difficult. The investors of the Plymouth colony demanded a return on their investment, right? So this is a joint stock company. They've put their money together, and in order to pay for their travel to this colony, these people had to get into some serious debt. About 1,200 to 1,600 pounds sterling is what these colonists owed to their investors, and they required to pay it over about 7 years. So this is a tremendous amount of money. So how were they going to do this? Well, they basically depended on agriculture, fishing, farming, whaling. They had timber that they could cut and sell, and they had fur, obviously, from animals that they could trap. Originally, the plan was to divide out equally all of this wealth, right? Sort of a community ownership of everything. And William Bradford speaks about this in his memoir on Plymouth Plantation, around, according to my little versions, around page 215 and 216, where he talks about how they decided to do things. And I'll read portions of that to you. It says, quote, "At length, after much debate of things, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest amongst them, gave way that they should set corvée, or work, every man for his own peculiar, and in that regard trust to themselves, and all other things to go on in a general way as before, and so assign to every family a parcel of land according to the portion of their number, for that end only for present use, but made no division for inheritance, and ranged all boys and youth under some family. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and saved him a great deal of trouble, and gave far better content." So in other words, the Pilgrims tried to work as a commune, where everyone would share the wealth that was produced by the group, and they would divide it out evenly. But this proved to be not a good idea, and so the governor did away with that, as I just read. So what was it like before that? It says, well, the women as a result of this new policy of giving every person their own land, he says, quote, "The women now willingly went into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before they would allege weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought a great tyranny and oppression." So before, when everything was communally owned, people would shrug, they would just not work. They would say, "Oh, I'm tired," or I can't work right now. And if you were to try to force them to go work, well, they would think that you were being, abusive and tyrannical, and they would resist it. And this would cause problems within the colony. He continues, quote, "The experience that was had by this common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato and other ancients who applauded it, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a common wealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For this community, as far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong or man of parts had no more in division of victuals and clothing than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice, the aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labor and victuals and clothing, etc., with the meaner and younger sort, thought it some indignity and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men, as dressing their meat and washing their clothes, etc., they deemed it a kind of slavery, neither could many husbands well brook it. Upon the point all being to have alike, and all to do alike, they thought themselves in the like condition, and over as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations that God had set among men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respect that should be preserved amongst them. All right, so what does all that mean? It means essentially, at first they tried to commune, but people resented it. People didn't want to work for other people's families and not get any compensation for it. So, what would happen is you all get together and say, okay, we're going to work all together and we're going to build John's house. Well, as soon as John's house was done, John suddenly just had too much to do to help build, the next home. He had to, make his fence. He had to plant his garden. He had to take care of his house once he got it together. And then once they built the second home, well, that owner was now too busy to make the third. And so by the time you get further on, you didn't have enough people to make any more houses. It just didn't work. People resented having to work for other people. They didn't like their wives and children being made to serve other people without compensation. So this little experiment in commune did not work. They had to abandon it, and the governor actually assigned each person their own land and made them work for themselves, and they actually started making a little bit of money. Regardless, Plymouth Colony never produced profits suitable to satisfy their investors. Despite the fact that several colonists used their own funds to pay off their investors, by 1648, the more successful and wealthy Massachusetts Bay Colony would absorb Plymouth Colony in 1691. So a lot of these people are going to have their debts paid off by 1648, but Massachusetts Colony is much larger, and it's just going to absorb them in 1691. Well, speaking of Massachusetts Colony, I suppose we should get that started. So let's talk a little bit about the Great Puritan Migration that's going to occur between 1629 and 1640. Now, the Separatists left England, as we already mentioned, in early 1600 when Anglican bishops began to fire their ministers and fine their congregations and break up their churches. But most Puritans stayed behind. They stayed in England hoping to purify the church from within. However, by 1629, we have a more antagonistic king. This is Charles I. And for those of you who remember anything about world history from last year, or whenever you've taken it, Charles I would be the king during the English Civil War, and of course it would be a war between the Puritans in Parliament and the Royalists. So we know that Puritans and the king are not going to get along necessarily. But starting at about 1630, there's going to be this massive migration of people out of England. And Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to start. It's going to be a colony that is automatically the largest colony ever to be started, right? So it just starts off on a much larger scale than any other colony in the Americas. 700 colonists on 11 ships are going to land in Massachusetts Bay in June of 1630. This is a massive undertaking. These colonists are also very different in terms of their attitude. Unlike what you see happening in the southern colonies in Virginia, where it's mostly men who are adventurers and starving. Massachusetts colony, and also to some degree Plymouth colony, is going to see entire family units transfer over. And it's not just poor, desperate people like what you see in Virginia colony either. They're not just poor indentured servants who don't have land, who are struggling. These are people who are not leaving because they're struggling. They're leaving because they want religious freedom. They want the freedom to worship God in their own way. And so, they could be somewhat relatively wealthy people, middle-class people, lawyers, trained people, ministers, very educated people with high skill levels. You're going to see artisans and craftsmen. Basically, entire towns are just going to pick up and leave, and every shade of ability and type of person is going to be in Massachusetts colony. So it's going to be a much more stable environment. There's going to be more of an emphasis on education. There's going to be more of an emphasis on work and literacy. And this is going to be a huge difference between the New England colonies and the southern colonies. Now, with the ascension of Charles I in 1625, as I mentioned, there are going to be these organized attempts to just basically root out these Puritans from the influence of the church. And so they're going to start abandoning England. Over 10,000 Puritans, according to this, 14,000, according to your little chart here, are going to abandon England and move into Massachusetts. And that's not even the most people that are going to go. More than 18,000 people are going to leave for Barbados, 12,000 for St. Kitts. So most of the people who are abandoning England, they're actually traveling into the Caribbean islands. So 75,000 Puritans are going to flee England between 1629 and 1640 because of the persecution that they're facing under King Charles and his archbishop. By 1640, Puritan politicians in Parliament are going to turn the tables and begin to persecute the king. Obviously, as I mentioned, the English Civil War would see Charles I executed for treason in 1649, and the military dictatorship of the Puritans would come into being with Oliver Cromwell. So the Puritans would have the last laugh here, but in the early years, they're going to get out of Dodge, a lot of them. Okay, so who are some of these men who are coming over here, some of these people that are coming to the New World? The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1630 to 1634, and then numerous times around that, 3 different stints, would be a man named John Winthrop. He was born in 1587. He died in 1649. And he's going to establish his home in the newly founded settlement of Boston in Massachusetts. He's going to inspire industriousness and hard work for the success of the colony, and his influence and leadership deeply impacted Massachusetts. He was more of a moderate, but he did impose religious requirements for political participation. Remember, these Puritans want religious freedom for themselves, not for other people. So if you disagree with them about religion, you're out. Okay, you're not going to be accepted into Massachusetts colony unless you toe the line and you have the same religious beliefs as they do. So most of the really important people, influential people in Massachusetts colony are ministers, and probably the most famous and influential minister was a man named John Cotton, who lived from 1585 to 1652. Cotton was an intellectual and spiritual leader for many Puritans. When Winthrop and his expedition first began to set sail for North America in 1630, it was Cotton that gave a sermon and offered a prayer for the success of their travels. Winthrop asked him, "Cotton, come with us. Come to New England with us. There's no reason to stay here where you'll be persecuted." And he said no, he wasn't ready. But after his wife died and pressures from the king began to mount, by 1633 he was ready to leave, and he came to Massachusetts and got the coveted post as minister of the First Church of Boston. And from there he had tremendous sway. Keep in mind that the Puritans are incredibly strict. I think I should take time to talk about this. Puritans essentially believed that anything that distracted you from your devotion and faith in God was sinful. And I mean everything. I mean, playing ball, singing, dancing, theater, sports. All of these activities were outlawed under Puritan rule. Even fancy clothing. I mean, I've got a button shirt here. Buttons were too fancy for these people. It was too ostentatious, too showy, too flashy. So you would have to have, hooks and eyes, something very simple in your wardrobe. So your clothes are usually very tame, very dark, very plain. They outlawed Christmas because, this is a whole nother thing, but Christmas wasn't really the holiday that we know and celebrate today. That Charles Dickens invented the Christmas that we know and celebrate today, some would argue. And that and Coca-Cola in the 1920s, but that's a different thing. But they outlawed Christmas. They outlawed feasting. They outlawed anything that was showy and flashy and showed wealth. And so the Puritans are very strict. You weren't allowed to have fun. You worked. You worked or you prayed. That's basically what you did. Now, of course, you can't maintain that all the time, but that was the expectation, that you would be working or you would be praying. So these people are very strict and very devoted. So this is one of those big differences between what's happening in the southern colonies and what's happening in the northern colonies. So in the South, the motivation for the southern colonies was money, right? That's why we're there. We're there to make money. We're there to plant cash crops. We're there to make money for our investors and for ourselves. We want land for ourselves so we can be landed gentry and be able to expand our wealth and maybe get a title. Title was very important. Even in colonial America, title was very important. So this was the goal of Southern colonization. In the North, money was not the goal. Religious freedom was the goal, or at least the religious freedom to prevent other people from having religious freedom, right? They want the freedom to restrict other people's freedom. That's basically what Puritans wanted. They were very strict in terms of what was allowed and what was not allowed in their society. So we have this incredibly different world being created in New England, and that difference between the North and the South should not be understated, because that's foreshadowing to perhaps a conflict between these two very different groups of people, because of their backgrounds, because of their cultures are going to be very different. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about these religious conflicts and how this is going to lead to additional colonies. Principally Rhode Island is the one I'm going to talk the most about. Rhode Island is going to come about because of a man named Roger Williams. So we need to talk about Roger Williams. He lived from 1603 to 1683, and he got into a little bit of a disagreement with the Boston elite, with the Puritan elites in Boston. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, and he was offered a minister position, but he turned it down because he was a little bit more of a separatist than a Puritan. He didn't think that the church could reform from within, so the Puritans were like, you're a little too crazy. In fact, his heretical ideas led to sort of a religious conflict with John Cotton and the mainstream Puritan church altogether. And so he was forced to flee, right? So he left Boston, went to Salem in Massachusetts, and eventually his disagreements followed him there. and he ran away from Salem down into what would become Rhode Island with the Narragansett, where he had good relations with the Narragansett. He lived with those Indians from 1631 to 1632, and he had some crazy ideas. I mean, this Roger Williams guy, he had some crazy ideas. For example, he thought that taking land from the natives without compensating them was wrong. How about that? That's a crazy idea. He also believed that you should be tolerant of other people's religious views. You should allow people freedom of conscience, and that we should separate church and state so that people can worship and still be represented by their government. Right? This guy was a crazy man, clearly. Roger Williams is also famous for being the founder of the Baptist Church. So those of you who are Baptists probably are sitting there going, I know this guy. But in late 1633, he's going to come back before the court in Boston, because of his opinions. He's going to get in trouble again. He was condemned for his quote-unquote dangerous opinions in 1635, basically removed from his position as a minister altogether. So, yet again, he fled to the tribes to avoid expulsion and problems, and he lived with the Narragansett, and he actually was quite helpful. There are going to be a couple of wars, the Pequot War between 1637 and 1638, where Williams is going to serve as an ambassador with these native tribes and the colonists. He would return to England for the purposes of securing a charter to create a new colony called Rhode Island and Providence Plantations in 1644, and so that's what he did, right? So he goes off. Let me move out of the way here. He goes into Providence, which is in modern day Rhode Island, where the Narragansett live. He makes good relations with these people, and then he travels back to England in 1644, gets permission to start his own colony, where he's going to allow religious freedom. Okay. All right. Another religious controversy, is the Antinomian Controversy. This is Anne Hutchinson, who was born in 1591, lived to 1643. She would be somewhat controversial as well. She was a disciple of John Cotton, very close to John Cotton in terms of his philosophy, but she took it one step further. John Cotton wasn't quite comfortable enough going off on this limb that she goes into, but the Antinomian Controversy is also known as the Free Grace Controversy. So this is a particular Christian heresy that sort of evolved or branched off of John Cotton's interpretation of John Calvin's interpretation of salvation, right? So I mentioned earlier that Calvin believed in predestination and nothing you can do can lead you to salvation. Well, Anne Hutchinson took this idea and said, oh, well then we're under no obligation to follow the rules and laws of the church, right? So we don't have to obey the Ten Commandments, for example. There's no reason for us to follow any laws or behave in any way other than any way we want to. We can do whatever we want. There's no such thing as an actual way to get to heaven. It's just, God is the ultimate decider, and we should just live our lives however we wish. This was a bridge too far. This was a bridge too far for a lot of people. Although, when I was in school, I was taught that, here was this woman who got in trouble for preaching to men, and that was why she got in trouble. That's not true. She was not condemned because she was preaching to men. I mean, the governor of the colony was in her congregation. They would go to her home and they would listen to her speak. It wasn't the fact that she was a woman. It was the fact that she was preaching a heresy. She was preaching that you don't have to follow biblical commandments. You don't have to do anything to get to heaven except just live your life, and God will pick you if he thinks you should go. And so this was deemed kind of a dangerous idea because church leaders were afraid that it would lead to the decline of morality. If you can define morality any way you want, well, then anything I do is okay. I mean, I can slap my wife. It's okay. God will select me to go to heaven or not, depending on not whether or not I slap my wife, but depending on whether it's in his will. So this was somewhat controversial, obviously, and she would be expelled and excommunicated from the Boston church. She, along with her followers and family, moved to Manhattan Island, where they were killed in an Indian raid in 1643. So she wouldn't last very long on her own, but she is somewhat famous. But so here we have, basically a disagreement with the church in Boston leads to the creation of Rhode Island, leads to the expulsion of Anne Hutchinson and many of her followers. This is pretty common. So I'm going to show you this. Let me get out of the way real quick. I'm going to show you this Massachusetts Bay. This is Massachusetts is the hub of New England. Okay, every earlier colony was absorbed by it in New England, and every colony that came out of it was due to an expulsion, right? So they got rid of people that they didn't want. And you can sort of see that. So you can see that Connecticut, between 1635 and 1636, Rhode Island, obviously, 1636. Plymouth Colony would be absorbed into Massachusetts Bay Colony. New Hampshire, Maine was a part of this as well. In fact, Maine would be a part of Massachusetts until 1820. We'll talk about that later. So you see, and here's Long Island and Manhattan. This is where around the place where Anne Hutchinson ran off to. So you can see that the Massachusetts colony is going to have many children, so to speak, and sort of spawn out these various other colonies. And the main reason that happens is because of religious differences. They're so strict in terms of what they believe and what they will accept in terms of religion, that it causes separatists to literally separate, go out, form their own colonies and their own way of life. Okay. The Salem witch trials. Well, this is infamous, I should say. We should at least do a little bit of looking into this. These are a series of heresy trials or witch trials that took place in Salem, Massachusetts. It led to 19 executions, 14 of which were women. Between February and May of 1692, witch hysteria struck Salem, and it caused quite a problem. I've got an account here. See if I can pull it up for you. If I can get the internet to work in my... Okay, here we go. So here's an account of it. This is a brief and true narrative of some reasonable, remarkable passages relating to sundry persons afflicted by witchcraft at Salem Village, which happened from the 19th of March to the 5th of April in 1692. This was collected by Deodat Lawson and was published in 1692, the same year. So this is an actual account of what happened. And it's sort of interesting to see how this came to be. Now, many of you, perhaps in American literature, you will read The Crucible, which is an allegory. It talks about this period in American history and compares it to the Red Scare in the 1950s. But it does a pretty good job of sort of covering the panic that ensued. So I'll read a little bit to you so you get a feeling for what's happening. In the beginning of the evening, I went to give Mr. P. A visit. When I was there, his kinswoman, Abigail Williams, about 12, had a grievous fit, and she was at first hurried with violence to and fro in the room, though Miss Ingersoll endeavored to hold her, sometimes making as if she would fly, stretching up her arms as high as she could and crying "Whish, whish, whish" several times. Presently, after she said there was Goodwin in, and said, "Do you not see her? Why, she stands there." And she said Goodwin offered her the book, but she was resolved she would not take it, saying often, I won't take it. I do not know that book. I'm sure it is none of God's book. It is the devil's book, for aught I know." After that, she would run to the fire and began to throw firebrands about the house and run against the back as if she would run up the chimney. And as they say, she had attempted to go into the fire in other fits. All right, so basically what happens here is these girls are having a good time, playing a game. They get caught and they are embarrassed. Now, remember, the Puritans are incredibly strict, and so Abigail Williams, she's related to the minister in the town, and she's trying to cover her tracks. She's trying to pretend as though she's possessed by something, is to explain her erratic behavior. Plus, at first, it's just a game that they're playing. Eventually, some of the internal conflicts, the disagreements between the adults, begin to enter into this. So, in other words, Abigail's, women would go to Abigail and say, "Well, do you not see so and so? Is so and so not a witch?" So they would kind of lead her to go, "Oh, yes, I do see so and so," and then they would be accused of witchcraft. The thing is that once you're accused and convicted of witchcraft, all of your property is confiscated and then sold. So people were trying to get their neighbors convicted so that they could amass more wealth or get rid of a political rival. So the Salem witch trial is an interesting little event. It does help to it's an interesting event that sort of demonstrates the fear and superstition of a lot of people. But once this sort of mental contagion wears out, people get over it. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to go through this type of fear. You could argue that much of the same fear surrounds COVID today. People are really scared, and so they're not really thinking; they're just emoting. You've got people going to school board meetings saying, "Well, if your child doesn't wear a mask, they're murdering my child," which is clearly an overstatement. But it's the same type of sort of mass hysteria that can sometimes catch people. If you're not aware. Anyway, so that is our conversation about the New England colonies. We will talk a little bit more about the colonies in general, life in the colonies, and how they were ruled and governed. We'll talk also a little bit more about population and be wrapping up. So we'll be wrapping up this unit with our next lecture. All right, see you then.